I thought if I could write something that is really, I would call it almost like a blueprint that can take the reader step by step from budgeting, all the way through to just doing things even on the insurance side, thinking about liability and other things to try to put them in a better position so they would have a frame of reference. And, the point of the book isn't to tell you, what budgeting strategy to use. You have to use this strategy or that strategy. It's to lay them out. And really, what I try to do is always tell people, you want to do what you find that you feel comfortable with, that you can develop a habit with, and that you can find yourself doing on a repeatable basis.
You might have to acknowledge something. Okay. Jeff, welcome to the Book Thinkers Life Changing Books podcast. I'm excited for our conversation today because my personal development journey started in the genre of personal finance. Now, before I jump in and have you introduce yourself and everything like that, I'd like to read a stat from your book and then get your reaction. It says, 1 in 3 surveyed would rather deep clean their bathroom than check their savings account. What the heck is wrong with America?
Yeah, it's they say really that America is a consumer led economy driven by the consumer, but unfortunately a lot of it is driven by debt, and it's often easier to spend than it is to save, and eventually that's going to catch up with us.
Yeah, I've read, it just seems like now that we're past this election cycle, which just happened, we're recording on November 7th. I don't know what day this podcast is coming out, but we just went through this election, and the number one issue for most people was around money. It was
Yes.
around the economic stability of the United States. It was around the debt that they're carrying, their inability to afford groceries and other basic amenities. And so, yeah, where do you think this problem stems from? Where does it start? Why are people financially illiterate?
Well, I think it starts at, I would say at birth on. It's just not really something that families really discuss. And I think over time, just whether it be student loans, you have things that didn't exist in the 30s, 40s, 50s, earlier, in decades before, and they've been added. And, you look at the 401k, that didn't come out until the 70s and 80s. And you look at all these different savings vehicles. It used to be most people had a very short life expectancy when they retired. And typically, I use the example of Social Security. The average age of death was the same age of when someone would take Social Security when it started in the late 30s. So, you can imagine you didn't have to think very much about savings then because most people didn't live that long. And so, really, it's a matter of transitioning and shifting, really looking at consumer finance and focusing on that. And the challenge I think for the education system is there's a big difference between economics that you would teach in a classroom and just simple things that they're important to learn about, like how do you write a check? How do you open a bank account? How do you get a car loan? How do you find a car? These are things that you have to do that are essential, but they're not really taught. And if you don't have I would say unless you have someone that's absolutely focused on that as a parent, it's just very difficult, and it's very, it can be very easy to get lost somewhere along the way.
You highlighted one of the things that I really enjoyed about your book, which is you are teaching the absolute basics and fundamentals of financial literacy, things like how to fill out a check. When we posted our review on the Book Thinkers page the other day, I highlighted that page because I'll admit this, it's a little embarrassing. I only write a couple of checks a year, and as a result, every once in a while I have to look up how to fill out a check. And I'm 30 years old. But that's the reality is we were never taught how to do this in the public education system. And so here we are filling things out the wrong way or confused, and that creates anxiety. And so we need
Mhm.
a resource like this that teaches us the very basics of how money works.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, you have to start with a foundation, whether it's a house or your life, and that's in particular with finance and just your general budgeting, your general life that you walk through financially. You have to have a strong foundation, and if you don't have that, it's very easy to make decisions that you can look back on and say, "Why did I do that?"
So, Jeff, you've spent 25 plus years in the financial advising profession. You've worked with hundreds of families and small businesses. What are some of the biggest learning gaps? What are people walking out of school still missing as far as financial education goes?
I think it really comes down to, I've said one of the greatest, the greatest inventions, the greatest advancement has been the internet and technology in probably the past 150 years, just the ability to pull information. And, with artificial intelligence, it's going to be even easier. So you can know everything. The problem is about knowing everything as it relates to having everything out there. If I search a financial topic, there'll be about 330 million hits that can come back from Google. Well, that's great and there's tons of information, but it really doesn't apply to your situation. And that's the biggest challenge that I see. 25, 30 years ago, when I started in the business, the internet, it was just kind of coming out. And people were really relying on going to, God forbid, a library or going to a bookstore and getting a book and trying to learn things. Now, it's almost like an immediate gratification. I want to buy a car. Well, I'm just going to go online and just, pick one. It doesn't work that way. And, really, I see really the value moving forward is really, getting customized advice for whatever your family specific situation is and then communicating it. I think that is essential, whether it's in a business relationship or whether it is a family. Usually, when breakdowns happen and you have conflict, it's usually because there was incorrect or lack of communication.
Yeah, I think back to my time growing up, and my parents are the best parents on the planet. I mean, I really was raised in a great home. I always call it like the white picket fence American dream, middle class, upper middle class. My parents were amazing to us. They supported us with faith and love and
Mhm.
unconditional love in so many ways. And the subject of money was talked about a little bit, but not very
Mhm.
much. I mean, I made a decision to go to a college out of state with no financial aid, paying out of state tuition and taking on student debt because some of my friends were going there. Like, I didn't even really fully process that decision or know how much money I was taking on. And they didn't know how to have that conversation with me either. So, I mean, I guess my question is like, why aren't those subjects from your perspective taught in the public education system so that students in their early teenage years, throughout their teens, start to understand debt as a subject? Like, I had no idea what tens of thousands or 50 or $100,000 meant at that age. I had no context.
Yeah. Well, I think it really goes back to the education system. And I mean, I look now, really there's only about 22 states that have they require a financial literacy program or are about to require a financial literacy program to graduate. And then when you factor that, several of those, there's waivers around that. And so looking at even the textbook and the information that's being used, it doesn't really get back to the basics. It's more at a higher level. And the concern that I always have is, if we talk about inflation and anyone, that has gone to college or has, I would say someone that is my age in my 50s, if I can go back and see what the cost was when I was in college, fast forward, in some cases it's double or triple. And, with college, healthcare, there's certain areas, they're going up at 6 to 9% a year with no real, I would say, unfortunately, there's not a real good sign of an end in sight. So, it becomes an issue where, there's no real incentive for the universities and colleges to really get a handle on it, and I think our society and the education system really needs to be more focused on outcomes. And I think that's what's really lacking. And just understanding, that there are alternatives, whether it be community college that it oftentimes is free, where you go for a few years and try to figure out what you want to do, or there's apprenticeship programs where they'll pay you, to go into something where you can get a skilled job and have a job coming out that most college students don't even come close to an income level of that without any debt. And I look at the debt that the students are coming out of and really the lack. And I mean, I can use my example. where I didn't really understand student loans. I was the first one to go to college in my family, and it was really difficult because, I didn't really, I was just, you just go in, you sign the documents, you don't really think too much about it. In some ways, I think y a lot of young adults just think that they're going to be taken care of. And the adults are doing the right things, and that's really not always the case as it relates to the people that are in the administration of some of these places. And I got a letter from Sally Mae, which is, I thought it was a magazine subscription service. I had no idea, but it's a loan servicer. And it said that I was going to owe about $1,000 a month for the next 10 years. And I really had to, take a step back and understand that, I racked up all these loans, and I really needed to come up with I would say a way out where I could work through it. In my case, I went in the Army. That's not always a decision that a lot of people would make, but they ended up paying off my loans, and it taught me a lot of valuable lessons along the way.
Yeah, it reminds me of another client of ours, Ken Rusk. He wrote a book called Blue Collar Cash, and he talks about, he calls it the $400,000 swing. So
Hmm.
he says instead of going to school for 4 years, spending $50,000 a year to learn, he said instead, why don't you take up a trade
Hmm.
or some other type of education like the military and get paid $50,000 a year for those 4 years? So $200,000 in both directions creates that $400,000 swing. And he's a really big advocate for alternatives to college, other ways to
Hmm.
educate yourself and make money at the same time. And I remember graduating high school, and that was never even in the conversation. I mean, it really wasn't. I don't know now I'm in Massachusetts, which has a very good
Hmm.
public education system compared to a lot of the country. So a high number of people, maybe 80% of the kids I went to school with, maybe more, went to college. So
Hmm.
there were no alternatives discussed. But yeah, I think that the public education system is, I mean, only 22 states. I mean, sounds
Yeah,
like we have some room for improvement there.
we do have some room. And I go back to say, well, you wonder, the government is asking why there's not household formation, meaning there's not people getting married, not people buying, there's people that can't afford to buy homes. The real reason is because they can't, because they have all the other debt that they're coming out of school with. And it's really a disservice to the kids. A lot of them really aren't sure what they want to do. And it's, not to say, college, is the be all end all, which it's not in a lot of cases. There's plenty of trade school, community colleges, things that you can go into. And if you work hard, the employers in a lot of cases will even pay for your college if you want to go to college, in the evenings and part-time. And, I think there's a lot of value to that, learning as you go, finding the right direction, and that goes back to just, starting out doing things that sometimes you wouldn't think about. Like, if you have a young adult, maybe say, well, maybe it's a good idea, maybe if you want to be a healthcare professional, maybe, one day a week, maybe volunteer at the hospital and see, what happens there. Because you may say, I can't stand, I want to go to a hospital once you go there. And then you can kind of pivot at that point, whether, rather than focusing and going in an area that you decide you just don't even want to do.
Yeah, I'll tell this story. I know the Book Thinkers audience has heard it a couple of times, but I really started this business because of personal finance books. So I was a junior going into my senior year of college. I had taken an internship at a local software company. It was a sales internship. And I was introduced in that role by a mentor of mine to business podcasts. And I started listening to podcasts to and from work. I had about an hour commute each way. And over the first couple of weeks, I heard all these successful business people talking about the same books. They were giving a lot of credit for their success to the books that they had read. And the same names kept popping up over and over and over again. And the one that caught my attention was Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. And so I went to my local Barnes and Noble. I grabbed a copy of that book as well as a few others. And in the first couple of chapters, Robert Kiyosaki says that the poor and middle class learn money at home from their poor and middle class parents, and the rich, they learn money at home, but from their rich parents. So not everybody is learning the same information. because it's not taught in the public education system in the same
Mhm.
way that it's taught at home. And so the cycle starts to perpetuate itself. Unfortunately, if you grow up in a poor middle class family, behaviors are typically caught, not taught. And so you'll just start to do what you're observing. And that was the first time in my entire life at 20 years old, probably, that I ever thought about it that way. I ever thought, wait, financial literacy, financial money management is a skill set. And the more time you spend researching it and trying to understand it,
Mhm.
practicing with it, the better you can get. And so if we're all forced to play the game of money, which we are, we have to trade it for food
Mhm.
and water and shelter, then we might as well be good at it. That was the
Mhm.
first time I'd ever thought about those things. And in a lot of ways, that was not the perfect book for me at the time. I think that this would have been a lot better because this is very plain language. Like, this is how it works. These are the terms you should know. And this is
Mhm.
how it applies to your everyday life. And by the way, if you're just listening, I'm holding up Jeff's book. So is that who you wrote it for? Did you write it for the kind of young person just getting into things?
I did, I look back on my struggles starting out and the lack of just really any sort of understanding of money. And I absolutely agree with the analogy between the rich and poor. And, really the education system, the thought process is that you can educate people up. And, in a lot of cases they are. However, the one area that's just really lacking is in the consumer finance and money section. And I looked at the books that were out there. There are a lot of people write retiree books. A lot of people write these books, and I looked at my situation. I looked at clients I have and friends who have young either young children, young adults. They're coming out. They people just ask me. They say, well, as an example, I have my son, started a job, he's working, should he come off my health care? And, immediately he's thinking, I can get the kid off the health care, but, there's so many other things to think about. And, I thought if I could write something that is really, I would call it almost like a blueprint that can take the reader step by step from budgeting, all the way through to just doing things even on the insurance side, thinking about liability and other things to try to put them in a better position so they would have a frame of reference. And, the point of the book isn't to tell you, what budgeting strategy to use. You have to use this strategy or that strategy. It's to lay them out. And really, what I try to do is always tell people, you want to do what you find that you feel comfortable with, that you can develop a habit with, and that you can find yourself doing on a repeatable basis.
Yeah, I love that. Well said. And you brought up budgeting. So let's dive into that for a minute. There are two statistics that I'll read for the audience. The first says that 54% of young adults think it's easier to follow a strict food diet than a monthly budget. And the other says that 57% of young adults dread the thought of budgeting. So, Jeff, help us view budgeting through a more positive lens because I think most people in the audience today are cringing a little bit.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with just, whether it's retirement or starting out, wherever you are in life, the longer you wait to do something, whether it's to set your goals, whether it's to learn how to budget, whether you figure out what your income, your expenses are, and you come up with a plan moving forward, the longer that you do that, your life becomes more complicated, and the harder it is to go back and fix it and make adjustments to it. And the point really is, and I look at it and I know there's people that buy different systems, Dave Ramsey, all these different things, and they jump right into it, and they jump into it and then they get overwhelmed, and what ends up happening is they just stop in their tracks and they just stop doing it completely. And so really what I try to do, especially on the budgeting side, is just say, you just want to take a little bit of time, look where, you want to gather your bank accounts as an example and your credit card statements, and you want to look and make sure, you're not paying in some cases two or three times for the same thing, especially if you're newly married or you've been married for years. I mean, I have plenty of spouses, and I always say, a good exercise is if you just have a day, over the holidays that you're off, just pull your statements online or, look at your activity and see how many of the same subscription services you both have. And, invariably they go back and tell me, they say, we found two or three of the same thing that we're paying for. And, there's just simple things that you can do to save money over time. And what I try to do in the book is illustrate that by having calculators in there with QR codes. So you could say, well, if I found, $70, $100 a month that I can save, what does that mean 20 or 30 years from now? And I think that's the other thing, with immediate gratification the way it is, with everybody needing everything right now, sometimes it's hard to put something in perspective where you're just putting a little money in every month, but what it can do with the power of compounding and growing it over a period of, say, 20 or 30 years.
Have you ever read the book The Compound Effect by Darren Hardy?
I have not, but I have heard of it.
Yeah, right in the beginning of that book, it has sort of a fun little example of compounding. He calls it the magic penny. You've probably heard the example in other places, but he says, would you rather have $1 million today or a magic penny that doubles in value every day for a month? And everybody says, oh, I want the $1 million.
Huh.
And it's funny because 20 something days in, the magic penny is still at $10,000 or $5,000, whereas your buddy has $1 million that
Mhm.
took the million. But by day 30 or 31, I don't remember, it reaches a value of $10 million. And
Mhm.
that just shows a very exaggerated, unrealistic version of compounding. But when you start to think of, yeah, that's $70 a month over the course of 20 years, I mean, that starts to get pretty significant.
It does, and I think the alternative is really the negative compounding in terms of debt, the interest that you pay on debt, and so that's the other thing really with compound. You can kind of look at it both ways, and it's really putting it in perspective. And I think sometimes talking and finding someone to talk to about it can be a real challenge because if you have a debt and you have issues, it's difficult to talk to people about. Especially if you're going to someone that you may be a mentor or manager, someone that you trust, or even a parent for that matter. And it's really a matter of kind of laying it out as best you can yourself and working through it. And the best thing to do is just go through everything and then really try to set some goals. And I say there's really, once you have a general idea of what your income and your expenses are, and really what you want to try to plan for, you want to try to set up some goals, whether it's short, medium, and long term. And a lot of times you'll have a little bit of all of them, but you want to really make sure that they're realistic, they're achievable, and you want to adjust them, if on an ongoing basis as times change, job changes, and as you reach the goals.
During the previous answer, you had talked about, okay, two, spouses sit down, they compare statements, they find things that they're paying double for. That's an example of miscommunication, or the lack of communication. And so
Hmm.
before we press record, you said that's a subject that you wanted to dive into a little bit. So let's talk about it. Why is money such a difficult thing to talk about, especially in a relationship?
Well, I think, especially in relationships, I think the main reason why it is so difficult in relationships because you have a couple often, very few people are raised exactly the same that are spouses. And so you have oftentimes, they say opposites attract a lot of times. That's good for many things, but one of the things that's not necessarily good for is money, because different people handle money differently. And so sometimes, there's just maybe an unstated discomfort for the fact that you haven't really necessarily communicated properly with your spouse, but you handle things completely different. And again, there has to be the ability to communicate and bridge a gap. And I think if you can do that, and it's not a matter of sitting down and tackling everything in one day. It's a matter of working through it over time. And just, a lot of times I'll say, especially with young adults, one of the times you can do is just talk, tell stories, tell things that you did, mistakes that you made. Most people will learn from other people's mistakes. And usually if you can show those and work, and help them not make the same mistake, that's where I think communication really comes in, and you can really go a long way in terms of just, building trust and keeping communication going.
Yeah, I got married about a year and a half ago, and it was such a strange experience merging bank accounts. And yeah, it created a lot of really interesting conversation. And thankfully, my wife and I, we are open and transparent, and
Mhm.
we seek these types of conversations. But I can imagine for a lot of people, that's a really awkward moment.
Yeah, it's very awkward, and because everyone has a different background they come from. Their parents and family members handled things probably completely opposite. And a lot of times, as you mentioned before, we talk about it. A lot of times the parents won't even talk to the kids anymore about money. So you're growing up, getting in a relationship, and you're merging households. And I mean, I'll use the example of insurance. I'll see people, families that they both work, couples, and they both have health insurance. They haven't even gone out, they haven't looked and said, well, we should combine our health insurance because we probably save about $300 or $400 a month just by doing that. Because they just, it's difficult to communicate, getting into a space where, traditionally, especially, if you have couples where maybe one came from a divorce, a lot of times, money is one of the greatest causes of friction, and especially in divorce. And, a lot of times people just withdraw and just pull away when they start talking about money.
Jeff, have you ever heard of the company Tiger 21, or the group, I guess?
Uh, is it it's a high net worth investment group? Is that correct for private investors? I might be
Yeah,
getting it
yeah, and
wrong.
it's I think
You have to
it's
be
more of
invited
like,
into it.
yeah, it's more of like a peer
Yes,
advisory group, but
yes.
yeah, high net worth. And the example that I had heard on a podcast one time, somebody was in it and they were talking about how maybe once a quarter, twice a year, they have to get up in front of the rest of their peers who are also high net worth
Hmm.
individuals, and they have to lay it all out, their entire investment portfolio. And then the group gets to ask questions and provide constructive
Hmm.
feedback and really push. And it's like that level of transparency terrifies people. And so I imagine the first time that most families sit down with you as a financial advisor, they're probably a little awkward and timid to share what's really going on behind the scenes. And you're hired to help them.
Yeah, well, they would probably rather, go into probably go into a dirty gas station bathroom and clean it.
Yeah.
That's kind of what the reality is. And it's just, again, I always say it's, if you can lay everything out and be honest about everything, it goes a long way in terms of having to correct things in the future. And, and that's even the case, I look at identity theft and a lot of, we haven't even talked about that, but a lot of the things that are going on with the internet, emails, all the phone, a lot of things where people can just make mistakes, give too much information out, and then they have their identity theft taken, and they don't even really in a lot of cases know how to fix it. And so it's just important if you can have a framework that you work from to kind of close all these little, I would say, little holes that can create a whole lot of problems for you. It's like a ship. If you're on a ship and it starts getting all these little holes with all the water coming in, it's probably not going to be it's not going to be above the water line very long. And I think that's the case with finance and just with money. If you can't handle things, it's kind of almost like a domino effect where then you start having other issues. If you have too much debt and you don't know how to even figure out of how to start paying it down or refinancing or coming up with some sort of a strategy, you end up missing payments, and then you create a whole nother cascade of issues for yourself.
Hmm. One of the beautiful things about reading different perspectives is that you can kind of pick and choose what works for you. I mean, I remember reading Robert Kiyosaki and Dave Ramsey back to back in my early journey. And here Kiyosaki's out here like debt is the best investment
Yeah.
instrument ever. And then Dave
Uh,
Ramsey is like, debt is evil. And you can fall somewhere in the middle or a little bit to one side.
yes.
But it's so great to just read different perspectives. I want to pivot the conversation for a second, back to where we are today, which is November 7th. We're a couple of days after this election. And I've noticed a lot of, from both sides of the political spectrum, I've noticed a lot of people pre election having a little bit of a victim mentality. And I
Mhm.
think that money as a subject, I'll be careful how I say this. I
Huh.
think that money as a subject is an example of personal responsibility. Like at the end of the day, the buck
Hmm.
stops with you. You are responsible for your own money situation, your financial education, your literacy. It's up to you. It doesn't really matter who the president is. You are responsible for making sure that there's food on your plate and a roof over your head at a certain age. And so I just think it's the ultimate form of like self care and self love to educate yourself so that you can remain independent and you don't have to worry about who's president because you know how to operate within the system. Does that come across clearly?
I think I think there's a level of exhaustion at this point where I think everyone feels like they need to take a vacation from the billboards. I'm in Georgia, so it was one of the swing states,
And
and
you're
I was
from Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah, so I'm from Pittsburgh originally, and then I live in Georgia in Atlanta, and 2 days before for Sunday Monday I was in North Carolina in meetings.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's like I'm absolutely exhausted by it, and I think most people are, and I think the sad thing is we have such a great country, and we have every opportunity if you're just willing to work from it. And I think there's a lot of places you go, a lot of places in Europe, a lot of countries where you go, and if you are, if you come from a poor family, minus having some lucky break, you're going to probably be poor. And you could work as hard as you can, but it's more of a caste system where, that's where you stay. The beautiful thing about America is you can come with nothing, but end up with, the sky is the limit. And so I think, there should be a greater focus on that. And unfortunately, I use a statistic. What would you say, Nick, the percentage of people who have passports are right now that are active U.S. citizens out of the overall population of adults?
Yeah, as a travel lover, I might know a little bit more about this, but I know I've looked it up. I'm gonna say it's only 30%.
So it's a little bit more than that. It's
Oh,
48%.
that's more than I thought,
Yeah, so
actually.
it's more the problem really I think stems from really people not coming out of their shell and not understanding the way the world is around them. And they say travel soothes the soul. I think travel also really puts things in perspective, and makes you appreciate what you have probably maybe hopefully a little bit more.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time in Central and South American countries, and when you get off the beaten path, it really wakes you up to
Yeah.
how the rest of the world works. And just like you're highlighting, if you're born in rural Colombia in the mountains outside of Medellin in a small farming town or something like that. And your family for generations has worked on the same little coffee finca for decades. It's like, how do you get out of that situation? We really do take it for granted all of the
Hmm.
opportunity here to be able to walk into a major city and hand in an application somewhere and get a job in a place that you don't know anybody. That's just not realistic
Hmm.
in much of the rest of the world. So yeah, we do live in a beautiful country. I see the American flag behind you. I've got
Hmm.
one tattooed over here somewhere if you could see it. And yeah, I believe in a lot of I believe in a lot of what this country has to offer for people. And you're right, you just need to do the hard work. Buying a book like this for 20 some odd dollars and spending a few hours of your time reading and implementing it is not a big ask. I mean, that's $20. It's the cost of a couple of coffees. A few hours of time is probably what you spend on social media every day anyway. So just focus it a little bit more on a book like yours and you can start to change things.
I mean, I absolutely agree, and I think really it's not and I use the example of the chapters. You don't want to go through and look. You don't want to do every single chapter. You want to break it out and do one thing at a time, and really use it as a reference. Because I look at it and I say, you're not really going to be sitting there, once a month and buying a house. Maybe maybe if you put enough pennies away, right? But and it's same thing goes for a car. But the important thing is really to have a reference that you can use when these things come up, whether it's trying to figure out your benefits, you're eligible for health care, what's the difference between a POS, PPO, PEO, HMO, ADHP, the acronym Central. The book was designed where you can go in and understand and read and see what the difference is between those.
Yeah. Well, listen, we covered a lot of great subjects today. I'm happy that we had a chance to sit down for this conversation. I'm happy that I read your book. For those that are on the fence, they've listened to this conversation, they're still here, they're hanging on, and they're like, yeah, I'm kind of on the fence. What do you have? What message do you have for that person who's like ready to buy, but they're just not quite sure?
Yeah, so I would say if you go to Starbucks once or twice a month, I would say just maybe just go once and just maybe just sit the other aside for maybe 2 or 3 months and buy this, and you'll be able to go. You could go to if you do that and you just delay a little bit of the immediate gratification for a few years, when you get older, you'll be able to go to Starbucks as much as you want.
Yeah, and maybe just cut the Starbucks out in general. It's a
Yes,
lot of
exactly.
sugar. Yeah, there's a lot of
Sugar.
sugar in that
Yeah.
coffee.
Yeah, it's just there's nothing the matter with regular drip coffee from a Keurig or some other entity. So
Yeah, absolutely. All right, two final questions for you. First, where can people go to learn more about you and grab a copy of the book?
sure. So you can go to I have a website, jeffreypanik.com, and it's Panik. It's not with a C, but it's basically pronounced the same. And I also have a website for my business, Balance Wealth Partners. But it's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, everywhere books are sold. And I do think it adds a lot of value. And you can, again, there's calculators, a little bit of everything in there that there's takeaways that you can actually implement. Sometimes you can read books and there's books that don't really necessarily things apply necessarily. I think you could turn around and if you read this on, day one, there's a few things you could do right away to kind of fix maybe some things that are maybe broken.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that actionable, clear, pragmatic books are the ones that have the best chance of influencing action and behavior change. So I'm a big fan of the way that you wrote this one. It's super clear, super concise. You can pick and choose your own adventure depending on what
Mhm.
you want to focus on and learn more about. Okay, here's my final question.
Okay.
Normally my co-host Luke is on here to ask it, but I'll do my best today. He says something like, Jeff, imagine if your business disappears. All the podcast interviews you've given, they disappear. The book and the next one you're writing, they disappear. But you can leave the world with one message, and it has to fit on a billboard. What does that message say?
Well, I would say right now after the election, why can't we all get along? That would be the primary message, and I would say communicate. I think sometimes we get so entrenched, I would say Democrat, Republican, whatever your background is, you get so entrenched in your specific just watching, I'll say, some people watch Fox, some people watch MSNBC, CNN, you get so entrenched in what they're saying that you never ask the people that are on the other side. And I think if you can have more where you go to a fence and you talk to one another as opposed to start, wanting to throw things at one another. I think, hopefully, at some point we can get back to that where you may disagree with the person's policies or their opinions, but you don't vilify them.
That's a beautiful message to wrap things up. I'll do a quick share and then we'll press end. The day after the election, yesterday? Yeah, yesterday morning.
Yes.
I was getting a haircut and I was the first cut of the day. All the other barbers were in there. And a barbershop talk is a great place to kind of get a sense of things. And we were having a really good conversation. My opinions maybe didn't line up with everybody else in that shop, but we were able to talk about it. And I would love to see more and more and more of that. We talked about the fact that the average Republican and the average Democrat citizen have more in common with each other than they do the people that represent them, oftentimes. And so, if we could just open that dialogue a little bit more, get curious, try
Mhm.
to understand how somebody else came to the opinion
Mhm.
that they came to on the same policy. We're on two different sides of the fence, but we're looking at the same item. How do we see that differently? And yeah, what a great place we could be in over the next few years if we start to have some more open dialogue like that.
Mhm.
All right, we'll end it there. I will press